Hello and most welcome to 955. Admire the view. It's close to Fiskebäck. Or where are we? It's quite windy today. Please let me know whether this wind will affect the quality. Still some way from a good vlogging equipment, but I will try to fix one pretty soon. It will be easy to record these things, and I would say it is especially important now when we have this with Susie Frobel. Just to say a few things, I start to realize what an incredible oversimplification to the level of being ignorant is going on in the West. We look upon the endogenous as non-existent, non-perceivable, and very easily molded by tools that are crude, to say the least. I think especially about this mindfulness. It's supposed to be that simple, so you can just cross your legs or lie down and you start to meditate, and it's no complication at all. There's no complication with the psyche whatsoever. There's no specific rules that applies. The psyche is moldable like a piece of water or a piece of air, and that means that you can do, like you keep your psyche in a box or in a plastic bag, and you can mold it almost like Play-Doh into what you want, and no rules applies to the psyche. Nothing has to be done in a specific sequence, and the psyche doesn't need an instruction manual or anything because it's so incredibly simple. I think this explains a lot about the current state of psychotherapy in the West. We know since at least 4 or 5 decades that it does not work, it doesn't change anything. Actually, it leads to deterioration of the state. But it's no wonder, because the tools psychotherapists and psychologists are working with are incredibly crude. It's something newly developed. It doesn't have any history to it at all. It's not an older thing than 120 years. And for some mad reason, it doesn't require you to be a human person, somebody who understands humans, but you can apply with the same IQ test and scholarly test that we use for other professions, like being an engineer. You can learn in a book how the human psyche is working. It is a piece of machinery, but unlike ordinary machinery, here we just it doesn't have to be anything specific. It's a very easy machinery. So it's a metaphor that is unilateral. We take the metaphor from the machine, but we don't care how complex the machine is, so that doesn't get transferred to the psyche. So we think that in some ways the psyche or the mental sphere or the endogenous is a machine, but it for some mad reason has 2 properties a machine doesn't have. And one property is it's extremely much simpler than the most simple kitchen tool, like a toaster. Because I can tell you a toaster is quite complicated anyway, even though it's definitely the most simple kitchen tool, because you need to know about resistance, you need to know about how to short circuit an electric current, and to do it not too much and not too little. So there are some things even to a toaster. But accordingly to this metaphor, there is no rules at all that applies to psyche. You can just make anything up. So you have a sort of a movable manual that you write what you think for that moment. And the psychologist or the psychotherapist is free to write whatever he comes to mind, because It is a toaster, but it's so simple. The second, and it's also moldable in the moment, so the psychologist can make up whatever he wants to do. And there we have to add actually a third thing, whereas when it comes to the toaster, you have to actually do things to repair it. You have to have a screwdriver, possibly you need some cable and resistance measurer to know where you have an electronic current and where you don't have it. But when it comes to psychology, it's more than enough just to talk to the toaster, to convince it that it is healed. And the toaster can't, of course, reply, should just nod somehow, say I'm better. So in the end, what the psychologist or psychotherapist or psychiatric person is doing is convincing the patient it never was sick from the beginning, or if it was sick, it is now healed. That's the only thing they can do. And we know scientifically, there's no doubt whatsoever, we know this as a fact, does not work, doesn't change anything. It do change the perception, but that is a passing thing. Most usually passes within 5 to 10 years, and people notice they are back to normal. Well, they never left normal, whatever normal was. Susie Frobel changes the perspective radically. From being the most non-complicated thing in the universe, and also for some mad reason affectable by whatever you did to it. It's like stabbing the toaster with a screwdriver and it still will be working, or you hit it with a hammer and it still be working, just have to convince it in the end. According to Susie Frobel, the psyche is the most complex thing in the universe. And all of a sudden you understand this metaphor wouldn't even work with if you said that the machine we had to take as a metaphor is the most complex computer in the universe, or the most complex nuclear machine in the world. It has to be Ringhouse. That would still be a change in a gazillion times what we think about the psyche today. No, she says something even more extreme, that the psyche is the most complex thing in the universe, and it has more rules than anything in the universe. It has more properties than anything in the universe. Most of these properties we have no idea about, for the simple fact we have been looking into the psyche for 100 years, but we didn't start without very massive presuppositions, and that was that the psyche had these three traits, properties. And take a gander, take a guess. My guess is those three presuppositions would have diminished the development of psychology, whatever you choose to term, extensively, handicapped it completely, make its development hampered. And this can be compared to this global take we usually have in the West, which excludes other ways of seeing things, which we think is the only way of going about things. You seldom, except for Derrida, hear any objections to this. I got a little overwhelmed, sorry for that. It is nothing short but overwhelming, sorry. Now we see a quite different picture. we have entered a new sphere, and this sphere is more important than anything else. And when it comes to interacting with the psyche from our own perspective, we have to remember your psyche is always affected by what you do. You can't be completely outside of the business, as is suggested by psychology. And a good metaphor for that, how this binding, this global take, makes competing models impossible from the very outset. This underpinning that we have is Heraclitus coming from Hippocrates. He constructed medicine without a doubt, but his medicine was crippled from the outside by some sort of archaea, and those were the different fluids, different phlegmas, and these hampered the development in the West, because everything had to sort of be subject to this foundation. And it's very hard to break a foundation, but it's even harder than you think that it has to be a foundation. Everything has to be paradox-free and consistent. We discussed that earlier. That is not the case in China. Acupuncture does not have to go well with Chinese pharmaceutical ideas. Sometimes there are some parallels, but there is no foundational system underpinning the whole thing. Actually, the system can be incongruent and paradoxical in nature. But we demand that, and this fluid actually made people suffering from anemia had to be bloodlet until the 18th century. I kid you not. Something that killed them. And when we say we're not like that today, we are really blundering us, because we are more subject to these fundamentals than ever before. And that has to do with the educational system and a widespread idea that it has to be only one foundational idea. That idea is a gestalt. It's not even a verbal hypothesis. Therefore, from our reality comes the idea that there is only one description. So no matter if we move to some other place in the world, this is what we will perceive in the world. That cannot be changed, can only be challenged by quantum mechanics, nothing else. Nothing else. It's very important to understand that, because reality is what needs to be challenged here, not our thinking about reality, but reality itself, the ontic thing. And looking at that reality objectively will make it much worse. And that is not dependent that you are being subjective or anything. It's the sheer objectivity that makes it worse. So get rid of the idea that we have presuppositions. It is our world that is in a certain way, and in a certain way that can only be changed with practical methods. Here we need the screwdriver. We need to do things, otherwise nothing will be changed. We cannot change from thinking itself, because thinking and the outside reality goes hand in hand. We can only change this by changing our doing. And the good thing is, by different doing it can be changed, but can never ever be changed by this ludicrous idea from psychology, psychotherapy, so forth. What they do in the end nowadays is giving the patient pills. You're usually NSS-NRI, which is like serotonin suppressor adherence. We also give different amphetamines and so forth. And these have the effect of lobotomizing the person. They don't make you healthier, because it's a category mistake. Nothing taken as a drug, food, bath, swim, massage, whatever, can change, because that can only be changed by thinking/doing. You need to change your behavior, so to speak, and thereby you can change the cerebellum and its activity, because the cerebellum is what governs thinking in every aspect, and that can only be changed by changing the activity of the cerebellum, and that will change the thinking process. That is how it goes. It has a specific order to it, and since that order is newly discovered, no therapeutic method has still to this day been developed that take that in consideration. So that will be a completely new thing. And it's exactly the same as bloodletting as a cure for anemia. When we discovered that bloodletting actually make anemia worse, like lack of blood, lack of the red blood cells, we immediately stopped with that. We will immediately stop with all psychotherapy all over the world when we realize that is not the way to go about. I wouldn't say we made a mistake, because mistakes are...
Sorry.
So let's continue here. There will be a complete change in the direction of how to treat different symptoms that are somatic/psychic, and I think the whole terminology needs to be changed as well. It needs to fit what we know about reality and the workings of the psyche. Things that strictly cannot be generalized into something, strictly taken cannot be made into something they're not. They need to be rediscovered. And since we found what controls the thinking process, this is the way we go about. And the thinking process are controlled by exactly the same thing that controls movement. And I think that goes to show that movement and thinking are exactly the same thing. And where have you learned this? Well, we learned that from, for instance, Pfeiffer, who showed that movement and learning, movement and thinking, movement and adapting with his robotics are exactly the same thing. And this is also something we learned from Science of Cognition, Tony Chemero. I'm going to put him into the postscriptum of this video because I forgot to check him out the last 6 or 7 months. Could be interesting to see where he's at now. Of course, affordance is coming from Gibson. It's also an understanding that always making a very strict division between reality and the inner thing, it's ludicrous, because it will not compute. And I would say deconstruction is also showing this thing, this gestalt, the underlying idea of Western metaphysics that sort of twists our perception. But do not look at it as twisting our perception. Look at it as a different worldview. And that the other worldview, we cannot say a world is wrong. It is how it is. It is an objective worldview, and this is how it is. And oddly enough, by fractality, we understand that it could be higher levels and lower levels, but there is not such a thing like in the metaphysics of presence as a worldview that is completely wrong. It doesn't make any sense anymore. Other measures can show like yes and no answers, or successful or unsuccessful, of course according to what you want from the beginning. Constructing a new car could be that. Does it sell or not? But you see, you need to put parameters, and those parameters are never absolute. They fit the purpose. They fit what you want to do. And this is of course also the lesson coming from Niels Bohr's son, Auger. When we look at the atom, we need to know what to do with. We cannot just say it has existence, because that doesn't fit anything you want to do with the atom. It needs to fit the purpose. You just don't make things and hope them to fit later on. It's like you get a whole box of truths, and you hope maybe somewhere in the future you can use these boxes of truths somewhere. You collect them in school, they never serve any purpose, and you don't even learn how to adjust the purpose to how you use them. So that would put you into a problematic situation. So you do not know how to adjust something you have to learn, and that probably takes years in itself. And this of course goes hand in hand. What happens to the poor old cerebellum? Since it doesn't get directed by movement or action, it will not function fractally. It will start to function in a less fractal way. And as we mentioned, high complexity in fractals are health. That's an absolutely necessary condition to have health. And the higher complexity, the better is your health. Heart is a very good complex situation where the heart rhythm has at least 20 to 30 subrhythms. They are actually competing, so they block each other out from a sinus curve, but they are absolutely necessary for a steady heartbeat. And a steady heartbeat cannot be described. It can only be done by the heart itself. That's why pacemakers do only a partially good job. They cannot do the whole thing. And so goes with the cerebellum, and that's of course why pills can never ever work. This is a precise action, and a pill cannot have that precision. And maybe the most important thing, the intention, because these things can only be changed by what we call intention. And a pill is, rather than intention, almost something that takes away intention. The moment you take a pill, you will begin to trust something other, and your whole system will know it takes pills, and that will diminish attention directly. So you see, pills do serve a counterproductive purpose. And for that instance, it's odd when I mention this famous author and inventor Elon Musk is right now participating in the debate when it comes to pills and things like amphetamine and similar, and he has opposing ideas when it comes to taking things like Ritalin and such things. He doesn't trust it, and well, it's the first objection, but his remarks got kills off because people ask him, you are not a professional, you are not a man of medicine, you should keep your mouth shut. Well, I think he has some point to it, but he should still listen to what we know from neurology. That is rather important and not to be ignored, or not the whole way anyway. Let's continue with this auditory group I was mentioning here last from Susie Frobel, and I was just going into the second experiment, and that ran simultaneously with the one previously described. You have to go back 2 episodes. That would be what episode would that be? 953, I would think. A second experiment ran simultaneously with the one I have described. In it, a group just passively watch the simultaneous and non-simultaneous flashes and beeps. The participants of this group, who were not required to react by pressing a button, surprisingly showed an increase in window size during the course of the training week. This suggests that perception without action does not yield the temporal window. In both experiments, the main modification in window size happened surprisingly fast. That is to say, 1 day of training, and the effect lasted for approximately a week after cessation of training. Powers et al. Conclude that the possibility of inducing lasting changes in individuals' multisensory temporal binding windows may provide strategies to deal with certain disorders that are associated with alto-temporal integrations, such as Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. This is something we should return to in the book in chapter 9, when we are going to discuss temporal misfits. Sounds interesting. These findings are of importance to the notion of simultaneity as defined by delta T depth. If we can modify the extension of our now by training, we can change our temporal perspective and thus create a different reality with a custom-made causality. This is so because the order of events we create via the determination of succession depends on our judgment of what is simultaneous and what is non-simultaneous. In the next chapter, we shall investigate how the extension of our window of now, with a capital N, and our nesting speed determine our perspectives, judgments, and moods. Sounds very interesting, but let me conclude this thing about psychology, because it shows very interesting things, and those things we could never have understood without the development of psychology. And once more, this shows that without great faults we cannot reach knowledge. And this is the coercive work with Thea or Thea and Alethea. This is constant covering and uncovering, and you can say that lack of knowledge, a falsehood, is in some way an absolute prerequisite for truth. So they are not opposites always. So we can learn from psychology, and what we can learn here is that it is partly right. It starts with reality, just like classical physics, and it goes from reality and it goes upward. But what we learn from quantum mechanics is that reality is not what is not too correct to say that reality is different, but it has different levels to it, and it affirms that classical physics is correct to many levels, but there is a higher level. Once you take it one step higher, you get a different physics. So the ordinary physics of normal man could be said, to some extent, as actually classical. Can definitely be said to be psychological, because the people who constructed psychology, this is how they perceived the world. Perceived it like coming to them projecting nothing outwards. So they started from the things they had at hand. They made, in a way, without criticizing phenomenology, they made an epoche. They put the world into parentheses and they went to the things themselves. where it might be more correct for the metaphor to be completely parallel, to say they went to the world directly, their experience of it at least. And it's not correct to say that that experience was wrong. It is rather that quantum mechanics shows another reality where it's not enough to claim existence. It's a matter of levels of complexity. To some level, it's quite alright to speak about existence. Is the cat live or dead? In the normal conversation should have the answer yes or no. And just as Sture said, he's completely correct. All his patients are either dead or alive. Him admitting something else would have been an intellectual suicide, an intellectual dishonesty, or cowardice, maybe is the best word. It would be cowardice. He held strong, and he didn't admit to that for good reasons. It's the levelized reality of truth, and you need to be true on all levels. And you also need to understand that one higher level of understanding does not obliterate the lower understanding. So this is partly a criticism of Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts, because here the paradigms are interpenetrative, as all things in some measure are actually interpenetrative. They go into each other. They are not completely disjunct. We don't live in a reality where things are apart in that strict manner. Actually, it doesn't even make sense if you go into the details to say such a thing. It doesn't become understandable. It has murky areas, and that those areas needs to be more uncovered, and that will help us to go into understanding. Otherwise we cannot get into a more proper understanding. Let me just start with the next chapter, because it's very hard to stop here. So we're at chapter 7, and this is about nesting versus global and local perspective. Once more we have this term of the nestings. How to understand nestings more correct? Well, think about it this way. Nestings are the matryoshka going into each other. When we understand that the matryoshka is constantly interpenetrative, they go to each other, they connect to each other, the dimensions are not clearly cut from each other. There is constantly a connection somewhere. This connection is also something that can be explained in fractality. And once more I have to repeat this: train fractality in your daily life. That needs to be trained. You cannot reach fractality without training. It's completely impossible. I would assign you a mission and just trying to learn, at least to think partially for a second or two, that the three dimensions, I do this now, but I still think of the world in three dimensions. I have my back there, I have my front there, I have my right there, I have my left there, and this is in three dimensions. And within that, I think fractality abodes. Try to think that the directions I was pointing to are also fractal. And don't try too much, please, but try it for a short while. This can be trained, we know that, but you should not press yourself, and never ever try to understand this in the old way. There's a big warning here. Do not try to understand fractality from a three-dimensional perspective, but try it for a second or two. It's quite all right. So you start with this is something you can't choose, but you are going to be into 3 dimensions until you train this for 4 or 5 months or something, and this is opening up to space. And you need to trust the process, because it doesn't really make sense. Why should I take in my back? Just believe it. Well, once you understand that the universe is fractal, that will actually make complete sense. You'll understand sort of this is part of your body, and ignoring what's behind you is in reality, in fractal reality, as weird as ignoring your own arm. There's no difference whatsoever. That has to do with the interpenetrated force of fractality. So that's an assignment for you, but don't overhasten the exercise. Don't press it, because this is done stepwise. Because understanding is fractal, but on your low fractal level you shouldn't understand this, because you don't have the capacity. There's no complex. There's not complexity enough to understand it. I don't have it either, of course, because they can all be trained, and I just started. So good luck there, and don't give up. Fractality is what the world is made up with, and it will explain so much more of reality. You will gain a lot, trust me. So go on with it, and good luck with it, and I say thank you very much, and a very pleasant afternoon. And I end with this sea view here.